April 17, 1944. Campshanks, New York. The spring wind carried the scent of machine oil and fresh-cut steel. Behind a line of barbed wire, dozens of captured German soldiers stood silently, their gray uniforms stiff with travel dust, eyes fixed on the thunderous rhythm beyond the fence. The sound wasn't artillery. It was the heartbeat of American industry, the pounding of hammers, the whine of drills, and the hiss of welding torches echoing through the open bay doors of a tank assembly plant just across the field. The prisoners watched in disbelief as sparks danced like fireflies above the factory floor. And what stunned them most were the faces behind the masks. Not hardened veterans, not seasoned engineers. Teenagers, boys barely 17, sleeves rolled to their elbows, hands blackened with grease. Girls in overalls, hair tucked under scarves, shoulders squared beneath the weight of steel. They moved with precision, fast, confident, methodical, fitting armor plates, tightening bolts, guiding crane hooks that swung massive turret shells through the air. A tall German sergeant, his name tag half torn, Feldwebel Kruger, leaned closer to the wire, brow furrowed. Kinder, he muttered, the word hanging in the air like disbelief. Children. To him, war factories meant men in uniform, strict order, and discipline forged by years of service. But here, on the other side of the fence, America's war machine was being driven by youth. He watched a teenage girl, maybe 16, slide a steel pin through the track of a Sherman tank, her arms shaking with effort, yet her expression calm and determined. Another boy, freckles across his face, guided a wrench half his own size with practiced ease. Impossible, Kruger whispered. They can't know what they're doing. But they did. Every motion was coordinated, every gesture confident. The foreman, a man in his 30s, called out instructions, not in anger, but encouragement. The workers responded like an orchestra following a conductor. Inside that factory, the average worker was younger than most of the POWs standing outside. Many had left high school to join government training programs like the National Youth Administration or the High School Victory Corps. They studied machining, welding, and blueprint reading, skills that, before the war, would have belonged only to seasoned tradesmen. By 1944, thousands of American teenagers were operating lathes, riveting armor, and assembling transmissions for tanks bound for Europe. Every Sherman that rolled off the line carried their fingerprints, the mark of a generation that refused to stay idle while brothers and fathers fought overseas. The Germans behind the wire could only watch. They saw a new kind of battlefield, not one of trenches and tanks, but of education and industry, where the front line ran through classrooms and workshops. As a newly painted Sherman tank rolled past the fence, sunlight glinting off its fresh olive drab armor, one of the younger POWs exhaled sharply. "See Bow and Panzer, we were Farrader," he said softly. "They build tanks like we build bicycles." The American guard beside him smirked. "That's right," he said. "And they don't even have to stop for lunch." Kruger didn't answer. He simply stared at the tank as it rumbled toward the railhead, ready for shipment overseas, assembled not by soldiers, but by school children turned craftsmen. Somewhere deep inside, a truth was sinking in. If even America's teenagers could build tanks, what chance did the Reich really have? 2 weeks later, hundreds of miles away in the heart of Detroit, the rhythmic clang of steel filled the air inside the Chrysler tank arsenal. It was a city within a city, for million square feet of motion, noise, and sweat. The smell of hot oil, burnt paint, and iron dust hung thick. Overhead, cranes groaned, carrying tank turrets that swung like iron planets over the heads of the workers below. At Station 12, a teenage boy named Eddie Parker, 17, fresh out of high school, wiped sweat from his forehead and leaned over a massive wrench. "Come on, baby," he muttered, twisting it with his full weight until the bolt gave a satisfying click. His partner, Marie Torres, 19, laughed and gave him a playful shove. "Don't talk to it," she said over the roar of machinery. "It listens better when you show it who's boss." Their banter disappeared under the sound of a rivet gun hammering 1,000 beats a minute. Rows of young faces, boys with slicked hair, girls with curls tucked under bandanas, worked in synchronized rhythm, sparks bouncing off their sleeves. Supervisors, many only a few years older, moved through the aisles with clipboards, inspecting every weld and seam. The factory didn't sleep. It ran in 3 shifts, day and night. Teenagers arrived by streetcar before dawn and worked until the sun came up again. Coffee and ration sandwiches kept them going. Music from a small radio, Benny Goodman, Glenn Miller, mixed with the grinding of metal. This was their battlefield. Every week, the plant sent hundreds of Sherman tanks to the ports, machines that would soon crawl through the mud of Normandy or the ruins of France. And every bolt tightened by those young hands echoed across the Atlantic. What the German POWs couldn't comprehend was how these kids had learned so fast. In Germany, technical skill took years of apprenticeship under strict guilds. In America, the war changed everything overnight. Factories partnered with high schools. Shop teachers became wartime instructors. Girls who once learned typing now studied blueprints. Boys who had never held a wrench were learning to assemble engines in 6 months flat. They were part of what President Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. But to many, it was something deeper, proof that America could teach, train, and mobilize faster than its enemies could destroy. In one corner of the plant, a wall was covered with photographs. Some showed smiling workers holding lunchboxes. Others were black and white portraits of brothers and fathers in uniform. Tank crews overseas who might one day ride the machines built by their own families. Marie stopped to glance at the wall during her break. Her brother, Private Daniel Torres, had been in North Africa since '43. She ran a hand along the picture, fingers streaked with grease. "You come back, okay?" she whispered. "We're building them strong for you." The whistle blew, and she went back to work, goggles on, torch in hand, sparks flying in arcs of light. Outside the factory, visitors from the War Department stood on the catwalk, watching the rows of teenagers working below. "Can you believe the average age here is 18? One officer said quietly. Half these kids weren't old enough to vote. His companion, a colonel who'd fought in France in 1918, simply shook his head. "No," he said, "but they're old enough to win." And somewhere behind barbed wire, a German sergeant would soon receive a letter describing this very plant, and he would read it twice, unable to believe that America's war effort was being driven not by hardened men, but by the energy and optimism of youth. June 1944. Camp Shanks once again. Feldwebel Kruger sat on the edge of his bunk, the humid air thick with the scent of tobacco and damp laundry. A folded letter lay in his hands, written in English, translated roughly by one of the guards. It was from a local newspaper reporter who'd visited the same Detroit tank plant he'd seen weeks earlier. The letter described, in vivid detail, the very sight that had shaken him to his core. Young men and women, some not yet 18, producing tanks at a rate that astonishes even their supervisors. These students have become engineers overnight. Their precision rivals that of professionals. Kruger read the passage again and again. He pictured those young faces behind welding masks, the girl with the scarf, the freckled boy turning the wrench. In Germany, that would have been unthinkable. Training was rigid, slow, hierarchical. Youth belonged in classrooms or the Hitlerjugend, not in war production. But America had blurred every line. Across the barracks, a fellow POW, Corporal Meissner, leaned against the wall, reading a tattered German newspaper that had arrived weeks late. It spoke of shortages, oil, steel, men. "Berlin's rationing bread again," Meissner muttered. "And we still call this country decadent." Kruger said nothing. His thoughts wandered back to what he'd seen. The massive assembly lines, the endless rail cars filled with Shermans. He'd watched them vanish into the distance like an unstoppable tide. Those machines, built by children, would roll through France any day now. He finally looked up. "They fight differently," he said quietly. "Not just with soldiers, but with schools, with ideas." Outside, the evening light slanted through the fence. A group of guards passed, their uniforms clean and pressed, chatting casually. Beyond them, a convoy rumbled past the horizon, flatbed trucks carrying yet another load of armored vehicles westward. The same Shermans he had seen under construction now gleamed under the American sun. Inside his mind, the pieces began to fall into place. While Germany had poured its youth into trenches, America had poured its youth into classrooms and factories. One built armies. The other built the future. He thought of his son back in Hamburg, 17 years old, drafted into the Luftwaffe Auxiliary. What was he doing now? Manning a flak gun? Clearing rubble after bombings? And somewhere across the ocean, American teenagers his age were building the machines that would crush his world. For the first time, Kruger felt a sensation he hadn't known since the early years of the war. Not hatred, not anger, but admiration. In that moment, he understood something profound, that America's true weapon wasn't its steel or its oil, it was belief. Belief that ordinary people, even the youngest, could do extraordinary things when asked to serve a cause greater than themselves. He folded the letter carefully and placed it under his pillow. The camp loudspeaker crackled to life, announcing evening roll call. As he rose to his feet, he glanced one last time through the window toward the west, where the faint hum of a distant train echoed in the twilight. He could almost imagine it, a train loaded with tanks, their engines fresh from the hands of the very teenagers he once dismissed. And for the first time, Feldwebel Kruger whispered to himself, "Wir haben nie eine Chance gehabt." We never had a chance. Autumn, 1944. Across the United States, from Chicago to Pittsburgh, the thunder of machinery had become the soundtrack of victory. But behind the smoke and sparks, the war effort had transformed something deeper, the very identity of a generation. In a converted high school gymnasium in Cleveland, lines of students stood at long metal tables, fitting small engine parts under the supervision of a middle-aged instructor. "Check your measurements twice," he shouted over the din. "A single mistake here means a tank stuck in the mud out there." The students laughed, but they worked with care. These were the Victory Corps, teenage volunteers who spent their afternoons machining parts for tanks, jeeps, and artillery. Their lessons no longer came from textbooks, but from blueprints stamped War Department. In Detroit, Marie Torres still worked at her welding station. The war had toughened her, hands calloused, shoulders stronger, eyes sharper. Her partner, Eddie, had enlisted in the army, writing her letters from Europe about the tanks rolling through French towns. "Maybe one of them's ours," he wrote once. "If it is, she's running like a dream." Those words carried more meaning than he knew. For Marie, every spark, every long night, meant something tangible, the difference between a soldier returning home or not. In Washington, newspapers printed photos of the Arsenal kids, showing teenage girls posing beside Sherman tanks with grease on their faces and smiles that hid exhaustion. They became symbols of something uniquely American, the belief that anyone, no matter their age, could rise to meet history's call. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, German prisoners like Kruger heard news from home. Factories bombed, cities burning, the Reich stretched thin. It wasn't just the front lines collapsing, it was the foundation beneath them. And in every report, one fact haunted them: American production had not slowed. It had accelerated. At one camp briefing, a U.S. Army liaison mentioned that America was now producing nearly 2,000 tanks a month, more than the entire German output at that stage of the war. Some POWs laughed bitterly. Others simply stared at the ground. But Kruger, standing in the back, said quietly, "They're not fighting a war of men anymore. They're fighting a war of generations." He wasn't wrong. By late 1944, over 3 million American teenagers had entered the labor force through wartime training programs. They weren't just filling gaps, they were redefining what it meant to serve. While their brothers stormed beaches, they stormed assembly lines. Each hammer strike, each weld, each perfectly fitted piece of armor was part of a rhythm that echoed across oceans. The youth of America, dismissed by the enemy as inexperienced, had become the pulse of a global superpower. And for those who had once sneered at that power from behind barbed wire, disbelief had turned to silent respect. As winter approached, shipments of Shermans moved ceaselessly from American factories toward the ports of New York, Boston, and Baltimore. Painted in olive drab, they gleamed under the morning frost, engines rumbling like a chorus. Somewhere among them might have been Eddie Parker's handiwork and Marie's welds, bound for the Ardennes, where the last great battle of the European war was about to begin. The war would end within months. But the image of those teenagers, their hands blackened, their faces bright with purpose, would endure far longer. Because when history remembered America's arsenal of democracy, it would not only speak of factories or generals, but of classrooms turned into workshops, of youth who built victory from raw steel, and of prisoners who, for the first time, saw defeat not as humiliation, but as understanding. That even in war, belief can be more powerful than fear. And belief, forged in the hands of the young, can build tanks faster than empires can fall.